Test, test. Hey, look at that. All right. So there was a question all of the students used to get asked while we were in seminary, and that question was, what is God up to? I mean, there was an understanding that God was always up to something very unexpected and incomprehensible, and our job as seminary students going out into the world was to figure out what that was. Simple task. Now, it's not a new question that trying to figure out what God is up to. It's a question that our prophet for today is grappling with as well, the prophet Jeremiah, because for Jeremiah, times were pretty bleak. Things were pretty bad. In our text for today, in fact, he speaks these words of hope and promise from a prison cell that was next to the palace as it was being besieged by the Babylonians. So he's in prison because he told the king something the king did not want to hear. He told the king that God was not going to intervene and save Judah from the Babylonian invasion, that they were going to be defeated and that they were going to go into captivity. And no one likes a negative Nancy hanging around, so of course he got thrown into prison. Well, that and the fact that there was that whole, he'd gone to the temple and kind of told all the people there they were a bunch of den of thieves and things like that. Yeah, that went over about as well as it did in Jesus' day. But the thing was, Jeremiah had this very deep sense of what had gone so terribly, terribly wrong in his society and what it would mean for those problems, for those destructive patterns to continue to exist. So on the one hand, he understood the reasons behind the destruction that was coming, because as a nation that was supposed to be a nation that represented God, they were doing incredible damage to that witness of who and what their God was about. Because their God was not about child sacrifice, and yet that was something that they were practicing. Their God wasn't about oppressing the weak and the vulnerable, and yet they were. Their God was not about a perversion of justice, which is what was happening. And their God was not about the continued inequality that went on between the rich and the poor, and yet that's what their society reflected. It wasn't that God favored the Babylonians, by no means. They were a brutal, ruthless, pagan empire, no better than the Assyrian Empire before them that had destroyed the northern kingdom. So many were asking the question, what on earth was God up to? How on earth could God let this happen? Due to the fact that they had this particular role of representing God to the nations, their sins were, in a sense, worse than the Babylonians, because the Babylonians made no pretense of trying to follow the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And things are so bad in Judah that when Jeremiah talks of a king who's going to rule with this righteousness and this equity and this justice, most of the Judeans probably had no clue what that even looked like, because righteousness and equity were non-existent in their society. Yeah, last week we had that one good king who rose up. We had Josiah, who really tried to kind of right the ship. But even God knew that Judah was just too far gone. It's just too far gone, because one good king was not going to undo the sickness that had pervaded the society in general. And sure enough, as soon as Josiah dies, his sons come to power, and guess what? They go right back to doing what they'd been doing. All those detestable practices. And the problem wasn't just with the leadership, it was with the people too. Which is why Jeremiah earlier states that God is going to have to forge a new covenant. one that will be written on their hearts, one that they will not be able to forget, as they had forgotten and abandoned the old one. Because Judah has forgotten why they exist and what their role is supposed to be. So while Jeremiah recognizes the need for this destruction, he deeply laments it as well. I mean, this is his home. This is his country. These are his people. I mean, imagine that. Your own country, your own nation that you love so deeply has irrevocably devolved into this cesspool of corruption. Or even the religious leadership has so lost its way, they just kowtow to everything that the leader wanted. There were other prophets. Oh, there were plenty of other prophets that told the king exactly what he wanted to hear. They used God to justify not only their bad behavior, but his bad behavior. Living in a society where the rich and the powerful were preying on the weak and the vulnerable. A justice system that heavily favored the wealthy and the privileged over the already poor and the marginalized. It may not be so hard to imagine, because we could probably take that description and apply it to just about any nation throughout time and history. For as Pastor Chad pointed out last week, we seem to never learn, and we just keep repeating these patterns. And like Jeremiah, you would be able to see the need for those systems to be dismantled, but the pain and the suffering that goes along with it, because no one ever gives up that power willingly, it's going to be hard. And it would devastate you to your core, because no one desires destruction, especially destruction of their home and their society, no matter how awful they may wind up being. So where to find hope? Where is Jeremiah to find hope as he's literally sitting in a prison cell listening to the destruction happening all around him? What can Jeremiah point to? Well, he points to the promise God made to David a long time ago, that there will always be a king from his lineage on the throne. Okay, that is good news. That is good news, because as they are watching their home get destroyed and their king get dethroned, well, it's good news that there's going to be another king. And oh, how they longed for the good old days of King David, back when they won their wars, back when their tribes were all united, when they were a powerhouse that was feared and respected. We just get back to that. But Jeremiah adds a little twist to this promise. Yeah, he's pulling on the Davidic covenant, but this is clearly not a king that's going to be just like David. It's going to be something new. Because his promise also involves a Levitical high priest that will forever be in God's presence to offer up the proper sacrifices. That was never the king's role. So we have a promise of this high priest to offer a sacrifice, and the promise of a king who will judge with righteousness and equity, something few kings actually ever wind up doing, because the trappings of power and wealth always lead to abuse and corruption. And not even the best kings were immune to those flaws, as David was a prime example. David was no perfect king by any stretch of the imagination. So the hope that Jeremiah points to ultimately is that this king and this priest to come will not be one who is subject to those worldly trappings that regular kings and priests, or, just us normal human beings, are subject to. It's a king that is going to have to rule very differently and be something very different. Because ultimately, in hindsight, we now understand it's going to be a king that rules not by subjugating people, but by dying on a cross and resurrecting 3 days later. A king who is not just a priest, but becomes the very sacrifice that shall be offered in the presence of God for all time. for the sake of others. A king and priest who will proclaim good news to the poor and release the prisoners, free the oppressed, tear down the wealthy and the powerful, and raise up the humble and the meek. A king that will come to us via humble means. As a child, born to peasants, whose first breaths of life in this world will be taken in a feeding trough for animals, who will grow up to claim that he has no place to lay his head and tell his followers to give up everything and follow him. This is crazy talk. This is nuts when we're talking about leaders, isn't it? Because this is not an easy king to fathom or to understand, because it's so foreign to our own experience of kings and leaders. In fact, it's difficult even for those of us who are Christian to fully comprehend and grasp this kind of leader. It's so difficult that there are indeed Christian preachers out there who are going to make claims like, well, I can't be a blessing to the poor if I'm poor. And yet Jesus, that's who he was, because we fall into these old patterns of believing the only way to have value and worth in society is to be wealthy enough to provide that value and that worth. And to be clear, this is not to say that being wealthy isn't a blessing. It is a blessing. It's just a blessing that comes with a lot of temptation and a lot of responsibility, not to turn it into an idol or to misuse the power that it brings with it. But the point is, we miss the mark when it comes to fully embracing the reality of the kind of leadership Jesus represents. It's so foreign to us because this is not what the world tells us leaders are like. So at the start of this Advent season, this season of waiting and anticipation, as we hear these words of hope from Jeremiah, in the midst of his despair, we are faced with kind of the same sort of struggle and challenge that the people of Jeremiah's day faced as well. We are faced with the same yearning and desire for a ruler who rules with equity and justice and righteousness. We're still waiting to see that kingdom become a reality in our world. The king has come, but the kingdom is yet to come. Because how do we embrace this king and make him the ruler of our lives? How do we actually follow this king when we live in a world that promotes acts and behaves so very contrary to everything that he embodies? What is God up to? As my seminary professors used to ask, as we seek to embrace the radical nature of this king in our lives while still living in a world that remains so hostile to the form of rule that he brings. Because what would it look like if we actually and truly made this king our king? It would upend everything. It would change society. Because what would our society look like if it actually reflected the kind of justice and the kind of redemptive love that Jesus promotes and that God desired from the ancient Israelites? We may ask, is it even possible? Can we believe the words of the prophet here? He tells of this king. We know this king has come, but we still haven't seen this happen. Can we believe this? I mean, many millennia have proven that we just keep repeating the same mistakes over and over and over, that human sin somehow always wins out. Is it possible? Is it possible for us to change, for our societies to change that drastically? And then I always hear the voice of Jesus whispering in my ear whenever I ask the question, is this impossible? And Jesus says, with God, all things are possible. So as we venture into our Advent season of waiting, it is possible that we make this king our king the ruler of our lives in every way. Let us pray.